It is now my honor to introduce to you Eric Klinenberg. Eric is professor of social science at New York University. He also directs the NYU Institute for Public Knowledge. He's published 6 books. I look forward to hearing what he has to say to us. Please join me in welcoming, for the first time in Louisville, Eric Klinenberg.
Thank you for being here. I know this has been a really tough week in Louisville, and I'm sorry. I wish I felt like what you've just gone through was so unusual and unpredictable. Things like this never happen, and it felt like a really rare event, and it makes me sad that this is the kind of thing that's happening in our country on pretty much a weekly basis these days. So I feel some solidarity with you, but my heart goes out to you. And on Monday when I got the news, my first thought was, maybe this is not the time for me to come to Louisville. And then about 5 seconds later, I said, this is exactly the time when we all need to come together and do this event. So thanks to all of you in the library for making sure we did this. It means a lot for me to be here, and it means even more for me that you're here as well. So thank you. Can I clarify a couple other things here, just to change the mood? First of all, I want to be completely clear that when we started this conversation in 2019, I said yes right away, okay? Let's be really clear about that. The way you made it sound, it was like, oh, yeah, I'll come, but I only want green M&Ms, and I want no green M&Ms in my room. I was not difficult. I basically said yes right away, let's make this happen. Tonight, before I speak tonight, I'm going to go back, I'm going to find the first email I got from Chandra, which I think was in 1846. And I'm going to prove to everyone that, I said, yeah, we've been trying to do this a long time. So first, I'm very happy about that. Second thing, I think we should just clear it up since we're going to get to know each other in the next 15 minutes. It is true that it's my first time in Louisville, but I actually married a woman whose family is from Lexington, and she, you'll be thrilled to know, is a Kentucky colonel. And it sounds really nice. It sounded very nice to me, like in the courtship stage of our relationship, because she said, I have access to great bourbon, which was true, actually, but it turned out that was just the liquor barn. And then she said, and I have tickets to the Kentucky Derby whenever we want to go. Okay? We're about to celebrate our 20th anniversary in a few weeks. Never been to the Kentucky Derby. So I'm here in Louisville to talk about libraries and why they matter, and to talk about the broader category of thing that I think the library belongs to, which I call social infrastructure. And that's kind of a wonky and weird concept. I'm guessing most of you did not talk about social infrastructure at breakfast this morning or at the bar last night. So I thought what I'd do is I'd just give you a quick primer on that idea. And so when I say social infrastructure, here's what I mean. I mean that there is an infrastructure for social life that is just as real as the infrastructure that we need for transit, or for water, or for communications, or for electricity. And we haven't really recognized it and appreciated it because we haven't had a name for it. And it's important to give that thing a name. So it's not a metaphor. I want to tell you the kind of the big picture argument I want to make is social life doesn't just happen because people want it to. It's not enough. It's not enough just to want to get together with other people. It's not enough to want to just have a good society, to be in a decent city. You have to build the material foundations that make that happen. Now, you can get together despite bad social infrastructure, and people do it all the time, but you're much more likely to have a lot of it and to have it be durable and sustainable and rewarding if you're conscious about it. I want to say also there's different kinds of social infrastructure. There's some kinds of social infrastructure I call bonding social infrastructure. It's really good for getting people just to bond with each other, to get to know each other, and it's neutral as to whether those relationships are good or bad for society. All right? Here's an example of bonding social infrastructure. Country club. Right? Anyone here ever been to a country club? Very nice, right? Probably the country club. Golf course, tennis courts, swimming pool, bar and grill, lounge chairs, right? maybe nice big bathroom. Sometimes my wife goes to the bathroom in the country club, and I have no idea why. She's gone for a couple hours, but that's another thing. Now, we don't go to the country club very often, but okay, so here, country club, amazing social infrastructure, great for bonding, right? People join a country club so they can meet other people and get to know them better. Their kids marry each other, they go to parties together. Not great for the other thing that social infrastructure can sometimes do, which is bridging, right? Country clubs are the kind of social infrastructure that bond people who are generally pretty much like one another together. Not all of them. Some of them do better. But generally speaking, country clubs are exclusive. They look for a certain kind of people. There's different country clubs for different kinds of people, right? It's America. We got all different kinds of things. But generally speaking, not great for bridging. So neutral. They can bridge. Don't worry, it happens to me all the time. Other kind of social infrastructure, which I think is kind of more important for democratic societies that want to do well, especially for democratic societies that are having problems that have to do with, you ever use this word polarization around here? Does that make sense? Yeah, polarization, yeah, right. Bridging social infrastructure. Bridging social infrastructure is the kind of place that's accessible to everybody, that's open. Some of them are really welcoming. Some of them are programmed, like they're programmed in such a way that they encourage people who might not otherwise hang out together to interact with each other. And they don't always do this, but when bridging social infrastructure works well, it actually helps to engage people, connect people who are from different places, maybe even people who believe different things about the world. You know, it gets the green people and the red people, and it helps them interact with each other. Sometimes those relationships can be really important. Sometimes they make the difference between the health of a city or a suburb and the demise of that place. And there's not a lot of bridging social infrastructures out there. Not a lot of bridging social infrastructures. We live in a moment where we have invested a lot of resources in building, bonding social infrastructures, especially in the private sector, like places that make people feel like they're going to be surrounded just with the people who are like them. We do that in our neighborhoods, right? By the way, unfortunately, we do that in our churches more these days. Churches are getting more segregated, right? You go to the airplane, airplane fly a lot. You know, when I was a kid, just being on an airplane was an amazing, amazing experience. You felt like you were the most privileged person in the world. Now there's like 4 different lines when you get to the airplane, right? For all the classes of people. Actually, I think the airline I was on today had 8 different classes of people, right? And so everything tells us, you know, don't worry, we're going to create an experience that allows you to be comfortable. You're always going to be around the people who are like you. And I think part of the reason we're in the predicament that we're in this country is because we've forgotten about the value of the bridging social infrastructures. We've gotten so obsessed with, like, am I platinum, am I gold, am I diamond, am I super triple platinum? Or with the feeling like, you know what, I'm really resentful of the people who are diamonds and platinums because they really annoy me. They think they're better than everybody else. We think too much in these kind of clannish terms, and it's a problem. I don't think we can solve that kind of thing by just bridging social infrastructure, but I think that's where we have to begin. So why are we here? Can you think of a better social infrastructure for bridging than the place that you're sitting right now? Is there any place in Louisville where you could walk in any day of the week and see Louisville for what Louisville is? I don't know. I've never been here before. I got out of the car. I had one of the, what's it called, a hot brown? You know about the hot browns? I had a hot brown, 50-50 on whether I have a heart attack in the next 10 minutes. I had a hot brown. That's my experience with Louisville. But as soon as I came in the building, I was like, oh yeah, I know what Louisville's about a little bit more now. And actually, I'm the kind of person who, whenever I go to a town, maybe some of you are like this too. You are in a library at 3 o'clock on a beautiful Friday afternoon. But if I can, the first thing I do is I go to walk to the library, because that's where you see, like, what does the city think of itself? How does it invest in itself? Did it make something beautiful? You know, are there problems in Louisville? Yeah. Is there amazing stuff going on in Louisville? Yeah. You see it all within a few seconds of walking in the door, right? And the library helps remind us. It's like a reality principle in a world that's in a fantasy, right? In a delusional world. The library is reality. But it's also not just reality, it's this kind of magical place. Like for me, the library represents, it expresses the very best in what a good society has to offer. It stands for openness. It stands for democratic culture. It's all about accessibility, right? This is I think we're in the Carnegie building right now, right? This is the original Carnegie. Tonight we're going to be in the new building, 1969. Okay, but the title of my book, Palaces for the People, it comes from Carnegie, right? And I actually didn't go in this entrance, so I don't know if it works like this, but the idea of Carnegie's Palace for the People was he was an immigrant, right? Came from Scotland, moved to Pittsburgh, grew up in an immigrant neighborhood, and he saw in the library a place where people could make something better of themselves. And when he made money, he wanted to create buildings, institutions that gave other people that opportunity. And so the typical Carnegie Library, I don't know if it's true for this one, so I could be getting in trouble here, but you usually have to walk up a couple steps before you get in. Is that right? Okay, thank you. You have to walk up a few steps. When you get in, there's kind of like a pretty impressive entrance. You tend to see some big windows, high ceilings maybe. And the reason, you know why you go up those steps? The idea is that when you walk into the library, you are exalted. You're being lifted up out of the profane, the world of the tenement apartments, the world of the factories where you're 6-7 days a week, 10, 12 hours a day, right? Actually, he probably liked it when people work 6-7 days a week, but that's another lecture for another day. But the notion was that the library would welcome and dignify every person who walked in. To write this book, I spent a couple years going to the library every day, different library branches. There's one I liked a lot. And I saw you actually have to work very, very hard to get yourself kicked out of a library. Like, you could do it. I could tell you how, if any of you are curious, but you really have to work hard to get yourself kicked out of a library because the library it's not just a social infrastructure, it's also programmed by these magical people we call librarians. And I know you pay them so much money here in Louisville that they have all the love and appreciation that they could take. But think about this, like their job is not to say when you come in, like, would you like fries with that? Or would you like to supersize it? When a librarian asks you when you walk in the door is, how can I help you? How many places do you go where the first thing that someone asks you is, how can I help you? And they don't judge you. And they really are happy that you're there. They do want to, they really want to help you out. They're going to respect your privacy. If you say, like, I want to go find this movie, they're not going to say, why? Right? How many places do we have that do that? Not so many. Right? Not so many. I probably just got a couple minutes left. Came a long way for this 15. You get 15 minutes, they said. You get 15 minutes. Okay. Can you do a thought experiment with me? Can we agree that the library is a pretty good thing? I don't have to persuade you? Yeah, okay. All right. So a little bit like kicking down an open door here, preaching to the choir. So given that we're all here because you already believe what I just told you, so maybe I should have said something different, but it's important to remind ourselves that this is special, right? And by the way, it's not like social infrastructure is something we build, something we have to conceive of, design, invest in, maintain. Anyone here read the Old Testament? Anyone ever read the Old Testament? There's no line in Genesis, tell me if I'm wrong. I don't remember a line in Genesis where they say, like, on the fourth day, God created the library, right? It's not in there. We had to come up with that, right? So that's why it's important to stop and appreciate this thing that sometimes we take for granted. I'm not accusing you, but sometimes we take for granted. Like, the library is always going to be there. Missouri just they're about to vote to defund the public library, right? So don't take stuff for granted. Don't take stuff for granted. Actually, I ask people sometimes, like, here's the thought experiment, and we'll close on this. Imagine there was no such thing as a library. all right? No such thing as a library. We're all sitting here tonight in an Apple store, okay? No such thing as a library. And you invited me down, and I pitched the idea of the library to everyone here. And we all got really excited about it, okay? And at the end of this meeting, we said, you know what? Instead of our usual Friday afternoon cocktail, I'm trying to remember what they call it. It's not the Kentucky Derby. There's something, the Dirty Derby or something like that was the cocktail. They're trying to push that cocktail on me at the hotel with my giant plate of cheese and turkey. But it was very delicious. Imagine if we said, like, okay, instead of going out for a drink, there's no such thing as a library, right? And after this, we're all going to go, we're going to get on buses, and we're going to go to the governor's office. And I understand a lot of people here like the governor now. Is that right? So remind me the governor's name? Bashir? Okay. And we had a lot of respect for this governor. We said, hey, listen, we've come up with this great idea today in Louisville. We've got this idea for a thing that we're going to call a library. And this is what we want you to do. We want you to build this like awesome library in downtown Louisville with an old building that's pretty grand in the front, and then this kind of modern, brutalist building. Some people are going to say it's really ugly, but when you get inside, you're going to realize how great it is. You know, we're going to build a big library in Lexington, and then we're going to have branch libraries in basically every neighborhood of every city in Kentucky. We're going to build a library in every suburb of Kentucky. We're going to build a library in every small town in Kentucky. Here's how this is going to work. We're going to hire public employees called librarians, and their job is going to be to be in these libraries 6-7 days a week, and to be like aggressively welcoming to people, you know. To get people there, we'll fill the libraries up with everything in our cultural heritage. We'll buy books, we'll get videos, movies, TV shows, we'll have music, we'll have periodicals. Someone told me they got this thing here called newspapers, like you get printed words on pages and you read them. We'll buy some of those, get a subscription. We'll have like a crafts room. We'll have community rooms. We will have comfortable furniture. We'll buy a bunch of computers. People could just use them. We'll get laptops, right? We'll get tablets. And we'll tell people that they can take all those things home with them if they want to. They can just take them out of the library and bring them home. And to make sure that they return them, we're going to use the honor system. By the way, Mr. Governor, everything in the library is going to be free. People can just come. You come in for free, take them for free, and that's how it's going to work. Okay. Library doesn't exist. There's nothing like this. I know you like your governor. Raise your hand as high as you can if you think the governor would be like, that's an amazing idea. We're doing that right now. I'm spending that money. Raise your hand. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. I'm going to tell you something. Okay. I count about 8 hands in this room. Okay. Of people who like the library. 8.5. That's a half a hand right there, Indiana. That's a record, by the way. I've asked this question in a lot of rooms. That's the most people who've ever raised their hands. And I know it's a big deal that you got this governor. I know there's people in the library who like the governor, but can I tell you that 8 out of however many we are here, let's call it 160, 200 people, that's a low number, right? Probably you could win the American presidency with that proportion of the vote, but there's very other few things that you could win an election with. So what I'm saying is nobody thinks that we could do it, basically. Even with this governor, nobody thinks we could do it, right? And I think you should ask yourself why. And the reason is because that idea, now scale it up at the national level. Every city, in every state, every suburb. Think about have you ever been to the library in New York City? The giant lions on side, those big granite lions. The library in Los Angeles, that big tower, like a big Gothic tower right in the downtown in the city. Or the Harold Washington Library in Chicago where I grew up. It's kind of amazing postmodern building. Like, think about these incredible things. And every branch library, all the people who go in them. Like, The reason that we don't think we could do this, that we think we'd say no, is because that idea that I just gave you is the most radical, probably the most radical idea that's ever been pitched in this room. It's probably the most radical idea that we would build that stuff out in every town, every suburb, every neighborhood, right? Crazy radical idea. Way too radical for this moment, right? But this is the mind-bendingly wild thing. This totally radical idea, we did it. Like it's not a fantasy. Like we actually have those things, right? Nobody thinks that we could do that if we had to build it from scratch today, but we have it. And so I want you today to ask yourself how that happened. How do we come up with that idea? How do we generate the collective will to make that idea real? Right? By the way, we don't have it because of Andrew Carnegie. He built he gave money for a couple thousand libraries, but let me tell you, that's not why we have a library system. It's a big public project, right? How do we do that, and what happened to us that thing seems like a fantasy? What happened to us? And then what can we do to make sure that the people who are coming here after us, our kids and our grandchildren, don't go the way of Missouri? Don't lose this thing that's got us all here on a Friday afternoon when it's pretty darn nice outside, right? How do we make sure that other people who come next can have a social infrastructure like this too? I think that's the best way to kick us off. Are we good? Yeah, okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to once again thank you all for joining us here today, especially during this trying week here in our city for this very important conversation. My name is Gabrielle Jones. I'm Vice President of Content at Louisville Public Media, and joining us for this discussion today will be Nat Irvin. I'm going to read his official title, the Assistant Dean of Thought Leadership and Civic Engagement, Management, and Entrepreneurship at the UofL College of Business. And thank you all for being here today. So we're going to build a little bit off of the points that Eric gave in the beginning of this speech. And Eric, you definitely talked about this at the beginning of your speech, but I'm wondering if you could do a refresh for us on sort of in a nutshell how you define social infrastructure.
Here's how I define social infrastructure, and I'll do it fast. I would say social infrastructure, the physical places, and it could be organizations, but physical places that shape our capacity to interact. And the kind of argument I make is that when we're aware of that idea, when we invest in social infrastructure, when we design it well, when we build it well, when we maintain it, which is really important. Anyone who's ever been in a library knows, or any other kind of gathering place, you got to maintain it. And when we program it, we get all kinds of returns to our collective life. But when we don't do those things, and a lot of times we don't do those things, and I'm speaking as someone who grew up in Chicago in the 1970s and 80s, I inherited a lot of social infrastructure that generations before me had invested in, but the city was in a fiscal crisis, and it stopped funding the parks, and it stopped funding the libraries, and the kind of public gathering places fell apart, and you could really feel the sense of diminished life there. So that's how I define it.
A piece of your thesis that really struck me was the idea that social infrastructure plays a critical but underappreciated role in modern societies. And it was really that underappreciated part that stuck with me. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on why you think we haven't fully appreciated the role that these entities play in economic advancement, mobility, health outcomes.
We haven't had a name for all these things, a name that groups together these things. And so in the book, I don't just talk about libraries. I also write about things like playgrounds and sports fields and schools and churches, nonprofit organizations, community organizations can do that kind of work. There's a whole set of places that we don't always group together because we haven't had a concept for them. In the private sector, I mean, you're here from the business school, there's definitely lots of places in the private sector that serve this function for us, right? Like restaurants and bars and coffee shops. Like you try to understand social infrastructure in England without the pub, you're missing something, right? Or in Paris without the coffee shop. I focus in my work on the public activities, just because that's what we kind of have more control of in a democratic society. And there's always the issue in the private market that sometimes they can wind up getting very exclusive and expensive. So I think that's another, that's a reason, that we should talk about them, but in kind of a slightly different way. And I guess the other reason why I think we take, why we don't pay attention to them, why they're underappreciated, is because, as I mentioned, we kind of take them for granted. We treat them like they're our birthright, like they've always been there. And it's just to take one quick example, and then we can open up more. Like, I want you to think about the playground, right? Because playground's kind of an interesting thing. Like the library, there's no, on the third day, God created the playground in Genesis. We had to come up with them, right? We had to build them. We had to make those things. And let me just ask you, like, if I wanted to know how many relationships exist in Louisville over the last century because two families met each other at the same playground, they're pushing their kids on the same swing set at the same time, and they started up a conversation, and then they had a picnic together, and they shared phone numbers, and then they went over to each other's houses, and then they met each other's friends in the kind of community. How many, just the last century, I don't want you to go too far back, but just in the last 100 years, someone give me, say, like, how many relationships do you think exist in Louisville because two families met at a playground? What's your guess? 12? 12? No? Way more than 120? Way more. Zillions, you think? Zillions? It's a really dumb question. There's no way, we have no idea of knowing the answer to that. But I think what we're all feeling is it's a huge number. It's like millions and millions and millions for sure in one little city. And those things don't just happen. Like, if you took away the playground, if you took away, it's true that families might have met, like, while they were dodging cars on the street because there was nowhere else to hang out, right? Remember that game we used to play with kids, like dodging the cars on the street? That was pretty fun, 1970s in Chicago. We literally did do that because we had no playgrounds. But I think, like, having playgrounds as social infrastructure completely transforms what it means to live in a neighborhood or a suburb. And I know lots of families that move to suburbs because they can get better playgrounds and better libraries. So we don't have a name for it, and we don't appreciate it, and we act like kind of spoiled children, like we're entitled to all this stuff. And I think one of the sobering things about this moment is that all kinds of things that we took for granted are now maybe up for grabs. And the only way we're going to get to keep them is if we fight for them.
And I'm wondering how you think our choices to invest or divest from these spaces in Louisville have contributed to where our community's at right now.
Well, thank you for that question. And Eric, thank you for your book. And also I would like to express my appreciation for everybody who's here today, especially after the events that have happened on this past Monday. The way that, and Eric, I appreciate your book, especially the way that you did tackle the sort of big issue of social infrastructure from the different perspectives of race in America. And Louisville will be a great example of that. For example, if you think about why our city is as it is now, how we have inherited, I've only been here 16 years, but we all know the history of Louisville, how we have the 9th Street divide. And so when we think about social infrastructure, and your book covers this, some parts of America had to fight for a social infrastructure. It was easier to have playgrounds in some parts of the area than it was in others. It's easier to be able to select and say that you would like to have a playground in your area. But I'm old enough, it's like, when you guys are talking about the 70s, I was born in the 50s. And so I remember how it is that our country has fought against certain groups to have a library. How it is that a community would think of a library as being so special that you would want to keep certain people out. And it is a strain, it is a part of us, of the human dynamics, the idea of saying there's certain ideas that we don't want to tackle. That's an old history of that's our history of banning books. It is something that's a part of us. Also, it's a part of us to say that certain groups shouldn't have access to that information, even with Carnegie's great generosity. But our history, and why we find ourselves in the place that we're in now, is because we did not ask ourselves the difficult questions of what would happen if you excluded certain groups from infrastructure. Well, those groups would have to go and create their own social infrastructure. And what we're wrestling with right now is the remaking of what social infrastructure is. And Eric, I love the fact that you tackle storms because, and I teach a course called Managing in the Future at the B School. And one of the things I do is I teach the history of epidemiology, cholera in 1854 with London, because what happens is when you study events that are out of our control, you get to find out how human beings behave. I also teach the history of the Dust Bowl in the 30s because there's another example. And of course, teaching history of epidemiology, you get a chance to see how people behave in COVID. Now, of course, all these major events help us to understand the weakness of our infrastructure.
Yep.
And so what I have now coined a term, which I'll add to yours, is what I think is we're in the midst of a social hurricane where we have digital technology, ChatGPT 3, and generative AI, which is going to transform the way we think about libraries, the way we think about spaces. And then we have this really dramatic change in our demographics, aging. And we know who's aging, who's not. And so a place like this, which look at us in here, right? Now, we're not very diverse. I mean, just look and see, right? This is a reflection of the importance of the library for some of us, but it may not mean that everybody doesn't care about the library, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that. It means something else. And I think when I finished, I haven't quite finished reading your book, but these are some of the ideas that I've thought about. And those are things, I think, in the last chapter in your book, when you raised the question, I guess it was from Zuckerberg, who says, before we put anything else in the ground, we need to ask the question, what if? And I think that's the challenge I think a city of Louisville is faced with and cities across the country. Before we go forward, how do we build the infrastructure that we need?
Now, we have obviously been centering a lot of this conversation, despite the many sort of places that Eric talks about in his book, in the library, because we are in one. Mm-hmm. And full disclosure, I am a library kid. I grew up in Pittsburgh, so I thought every library was a Carnegie Library until I was probably about 15 years old. And I spent many afternoons at my local branch, which was much less grand in the same way that Eric describes kids doing in his book. And it struck me that you talked about not only social infrastructure as a concrete term, but there being different types of social infrastructure, right? And kinds that form more lasting and more durable bonds like libraries. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about the benefits of these durable bonds from institutions like the one we're in, as opposed to the benefits you get from walking on the same levee or something like that.
New York City right now is trying to figure out how to prevent big and catastrophic storms. I guess pretty much everybody's trying to do that these days. And I argue in the book, like one thing you can do is you could build a wall. My apologies for using that phrase, but you can build a seawall, and it can just be really narrow with a tip at the top. But you could also, instead of just building a simple wall, you could build like a berm, right, that slopes upwards and does it really gradually. And so it has the effect of keeping the water out of the city. But on top of the berm, now you could build a park, you could build a biking path, you could build a walking path. That's all great, but most of us have never developed strong relationships with the people who run on the running path with us. And like sometimes there's a person we wave at, I can't believe they go that fast, right? But that's not exactly a place you build relationships. There are other places where that really does happen. Like years ago, there was this very famous book that came out called Bowling Alone.
Yeah.
You know about that book, Bowling Alone? It became very famous because some scientists have looked into that, and apparently that's the saddest combination of two words in the English language that you can come up with. As if bowling by itself wasn't no, I like to bowl. Bowling was a very sad, the metaphor was like that people used to bowl in leagues, and now they're not bowling in leagues as much. And the idea was American civil society is falling apart. And it was a very powerful symbol, and it was speaking to something a lot of us have experienced, which is the sense that the civic life is disintegrating. It's harder, instead of all going out to the movie theaters when the book came out, which is 2000, it was like families are just sitting in their living room watching shows. And now, from like 2023, I'm like, that sounds like a communist utopia. Like, imagine watching a TV show with your whole family in the room with you. It's like, it's all, everybody's got their own individual screen now, right? So I'm saying all this because I spent some time in the Brooklyn library system while I was working on this book, and they came up with this program that they call library lanes. You have library lanes here? Well, it's got some work to do, man.
I'll be lobbying for it after
okay.
reading about it in the book,
Okay.
I'm going to be honest.
Listen, okay, here's what library lanes is. If this is not an awesome idea for Louisville, I don't know what is. Here it is. There's huge numbers of people who are aging in cities today, and aging alone has become a really big issue. And a lot of us are concerned about like what happens to older people if they're alone. Things can be pretty difficult, and not every old person wants to go to like the book conversation in the senior center, because that is happy and exciting for some people and a turn off for others. But people do like to do fun things together. And so here's the Library Lanes program from the Brooklyn Public Library. There's like 8 or 9 branch libraries, small operations, like a couple floors. They got community rooms. There's TVs in the community rooms. So here's what they did. They got a little bit of funding. They bought the Wii video game system. Okay, they bought a Wii. They connected to the TV. They bought bowling league jerseys. They formed teams for older patrons of the libraries. You join your branch library's team, and once a week for about 2 hours, you go down to that community room, and you have a virtual bowling match against the other branches. You do one at a time. And, okay, I'm a big sports nut, very big sports fan. I had the great privilege of growing up in Chicago. In the moment when Michael Jordan arrived, I left for college just when they started to win championships. I got to see Michael Jordan play in Chicago Stadium, not the United Center. I'd love to go to like a great sports match. It's a great thing for me. I've probably never been in a sports match with as much joy and excitement in the room as there was when I watched the New Lots Rollers compete against the other branch not far from them in Brooklyn. There weren't 20,000 people in the room. There were like 14 people in the room. But what I realized when I was with those folks is that these were people, like the first book I wrote was about a heat wave in Chicago. And it was a book about people who were, a lot of older people dying alone. It was a book about social isolation. The people who were in the room with me doing digital bowling in the library were exactly the people who were most likely to die in the heat wave. But instead of sitting at home alone and being isolated, they were having so much fun together. I have photographs of it. I've got videos I put on my Twitter feed sometime. Like, they're laughing and smiling and forming relationships. And they don't just spend time with each other on the Thursday that they do the bowling league. They're interacting with each other in a durable way. And we have the ability to take buildings like this and supercharge them with creative programming like that. And there's no reason why every library in Kentucky and every library in the country shouldn't be coming up with those kinds of things. And I'm sure you do lots of things that are like that now. The question is just like, what more can we do? So some kinds of social infrastructure really do have the ability to help foster relationships that will change your life and maybe even save it.
In my time, I've lived in 8 different metro areas.
Wow.
And in this era, that means I've seen a lot of gentrification. And I've seen libraries play a really interesting role in communities when gentrification starts. Sort of on the one hand, I've seen libraries in gentrifying areas be rushed to the top of the list for renovation and expansion and advancement. But then when those libraries open, they're often the only spaces in those communities where everyone seems to be welcomed and seems to feel a sense of place amid new yoga studios and coffee shops and things like that. So Eric talks about this a lot in his book, and Nat, as a figure of this community, I was wondering your thoughts on how our library has played a role in civic life here and what we could be doing to grow investment in it through investment in the library.
Well, I had the privilege of serving on a really interesting committee that Mayor Fisher started in, I guess, 2012, maybe 2014, something like that, and it was to help our community to think about the future. And I was on the creative educational committee. And one of the ideas that I had, again, thinking about this whole idea of the future and social infrastructure in a different kind of a way, I proposed, and the committee accepted, that we would have, now think about this, because this is something the library is a part of, that every kid under the age of 18 should have access, free of charge, to the symphony, science museum, to all of the basic cultural structures that we have in the city, but that a kid, if we were going to change the future, that children shouldn't be penalized by the circumstances in which they were born. Kids should be able, I mean, when you're going to test a kid later on and say, do you know Beethoven's symphony, Fifth Symphony, and they had never had a chance to go, why is that a fair thing? How is that good for the community if there are certain groups of kids who by nothing that they had to do with, they don't have the experiences of going to the Science Museum, or they don't get the experiences that you would if you had a certain income. Hopefully and happily, the city adopted it. Our community adopted it. And one of the places that students can now go and get the cultural pass is the public library. So every summer, since about 2014, and I think the last number is like 400,000 young children have been getting what's called the cultural pass. And this is the great thing about the business community, is that it's all paid for. And all you have to do is, you're under 18 and you have an adult, and I have happily seen in the summer hundreds, thousands of kids going from all of our infrastructures for free. All they have to do is just, they get their little thing signed. At the end of the summer, they get some kind of a big prize. That's an example, I think, of how our community is trying to create a new kind of, because social infrastructure, maybe Eric, you will agree with this, it's not, as you say, just a physical thing. People do have to carry, because your book talks about that. There are things that people carry with them, the memories that they have, the ideas that they have, the books that they've read when they come into contact with others. That's a part of building the infrastructure too. And so one of the things that makes me most hopeful is young people. I also see that in my MBA students, who I give them an assignment where they have to interview somebody who is over the age of 75, who is of a different race or ethnicity, and they have to interview them about their lives. These are for MBA students to help understand how did they get to where we are now. And it's a part of trying to repair, trying to bring back the infrastructure that we sometimes had, and we still carry it. But if you don't know it, if you don't talk to each other, then it's almost as if it didn't exist.
In addition to these durable relationships, Eric, another theme that hits home here in Louisville that your work touches on is the ability for social infrastructure to reduce violence, especially as compared to methods like broken windows policing, where people crack down on petty crimes and often use stop and frisk techniques. When I discuss sort of systemic problems in my social circles and family and friends, something that I like to say is it always seems to be easy for people to tackle the easy problem, the symptom, and not to go to the root cause or the harder problem. And it struck me in your book how you talked about people sort of reacting to this increase in crime in areas, or the idea of crime in areas, but not going back to like, well, this is the idea is, someone broke a window. How did the building end up abandoned here in the first place, left in this community? And I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit for the room about the researchers that you spoke with for your book and the outcomes that they found that, rehabbing abandoned buildings or even cleaning up lots had a better rate of reducing violent crime than these policing tactics.
So there's a chapter in the book about crime and how you can think about building social infrastructure to get at crime, maybe in a more humane way than sending more police officers into the streets. I say this with some trepidation right now as a New Yorker, because this past week the mayor announced that actually he's going to cut the budget for libraries next year by $52 million, right? But good news, everybody, we're going to get robot police dogs. For fun, while you're at it, you could also look up New York City overtime payment for police officers, which is so far it was, as of a few weeks ago, it was $110 million and counting for 2023. So New York is back to dealing with the situation by throwing police at it. And the problem is, so you can actually reduce crime if you get enough police officers out there. I mean, it will make a difference. It will just also dramatically increase the likelihood that people in black and brown neighborhoods are arrested more, often without cause and wrongly. It will dramatically increase the likelihood of police violence. It will not necessarily improve the quality of life, and it will promote a feeling of injustice, and it generally does. Again, I grew up in Chicago when the police department was literally torturing people to try to get confessions. So not metaphorical, like literally torturing people. So I'm skeptical about the logic of making a better city just through policing. I'm not a defund the police. When something goes wrong, I like to be able to call the police and have them help. But we also have to recognize that if we lean too much on policing and we throw out the libraries, we cause trouble. In the book, I write about this incredible science research project that's been happening for the last decade or so in Philadelphia by a whole collaborative team at the University of Pennsylvania. And they've looked into the impact of treating abandoned houses and empty lots in the city. I think Louisville's got some issues like this. Chicago, I grew up around this situation, so it really spoke to me. But deindustrialization was a beast. A lot of places in this country that had a lot of jobs had the jobs disappear and the neighborhoods thinned out. And in many cases, it's been decades since they were repaired. And Philadelphia, like Chicago, I'm taking it like Louisville, has just a lot of abandoned buildings, a lot of empty lots. And it turns out, researchers know that if you live in an area that's got that, even if you live in the area and you walk around it every time, every time you walk by an abandoned building or empty lot that's got debris and high garbage, high weeds, your heart rate spikes a little bit. And the reason it spikes is because you're stressed. And we actually know that there's a whole bunch of health issues that people who live in poor neighborhoods and depleted neighborhoods experience. And part of that's just poverty is hard, but a lot of it is that the social infrastructure is scary. It's depleted. And so they did an amazing thing. They got funding to do these pretty inexpensive interventions where they would turn an empty lot into a pocket park. You just clean it up, mow it down, and put some little wooden post fence around it, or board up and seal off the abandoned building so that there weren't squatters in there. You didn't have drug deals going down there. It was safer. And they found not only did people stop having their heart rates spike when they walk by, because they attached them to these Garmin monitors, and they literally could do that, which is kind of cool. But also they discovered that they were getting greater reductions in gun crime on those blocks than they were getting from increasing police. And it tells you there are all these tools we have at our disposal for dealing with violence that we don't, and crime, that we have been too timid to use. And it's easy if you're a political leader. I mean, the mayor's got other things to do this week, unfortunately. But it's easy for a mayor to say, I know there's crime, we're going to solve it by getting more police, than it is for them to get at the root causes. But sometimes the root causes are the places where we need to go to be effective. And we might also do that without incurring all the damage that heavy policing force can sometimes inflict.
Nat, do you see some opportunities in our community to take initiatives like this, or even spaces where organizations are already doing this sort of rehab work?
I do, and I think that would be one area that's a bright spot. If you look at over the last maybe 8 to 10 years, there's a lot of growth on the West Side now, and and we have a lot of nonprofit organizations who are combining the use of technology with the notion of transforming blocks at a time. And so we've been pretty aggressive. And I think, this is just reflecting. I wonder sometimes whether or not, when you think about now, what's the very positive things that are going on the west side of town, I often wonder, and this is a note for the future, when we're thinking about the future, each one of us, members of this community, planters, people who are about to plant a shovel, and I mean that in the metaphorical sense too, we ought to ask ourselves, Missouri is saying they want to defund the library. Questions like that, our community should ask itself, what is it that you think is the outcome? What is the intent of not investing in children? What is the intent of not spending more money now on young people and preschool? What is the intent? What is it that you think will happen if we don't spend more time with the next generation of young Louisvillians when we think about the epidemic of loneliness that's up ahead? So we have more people on the West End now who are building green spaces. It's a common thing to say that I love gardening. It now is a thing that we're doing. But you have to still think about the fact that we still, as a community, as a people, we quickly can go to just turn on a dime and say we're going to close the library. Now, there's some good news out of Texas. One community decided that they are not going to. You saw that small community outside of Austin says, oh no, we're not closing the library, which it spoke to me to say, especially after the events on this past Monday, our community shared this extraordinary event. And I was sharing with someone about our city that, we play big time, but we're really a small community. That's why it hit us so badly, why it hurt so much. And it reminded me of how good we are too, because we did, even, all the challenges that we have, we somehow were close enough to each other to say that this had impacted all of us. Even though we compartmentalize grief, which is one of the things that dogs communities, is the idea that you have events not like what we had on Monday, but we do have our share of violence. And we have to compartmentalize it. But part of what happened on Monday is it shows us that we have a reservoir that we can build upon. That's why I'm hopeful after, for having a gathering like this, thinking about what we can invest in our children, thinking about what's going on in the West End, thinking about what the private sector can do. The private sector, Eric, you talk about this in the book, when you have deindustrialization, what we've had is the commodification of so much of our infrastructure. So that things that people used to be a part of the public infrastructure, it's being siphoned off in the private sector. I think that's a real danger, by the way. Yeah.
Let's stay on that for a minute. You talked earlier about the 9th Street divide, and this is not the only community I've lived in with a very specific physical marker or even a street line delineating economic prosperity and racism from one side to the other. And we have some big infrastructure projects going on in West Louisville, the Goodwill Opportunity Campus, the Norton Hospital. But these are the sort of things that Eric talks about aren't necessarily designed to get people moving between neighborhoods, right? To get people from downtown or the East End over to the West End. Now, the Louisville Free Public Library is renovating the Portland branch and reopening the Parkland branch, which has been closed for over 30 years. You might remember it was a police substation until recently, and those are some projects that represent those more durable bonds that Eric talks about. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little more on that same thread you were about other sorts of investments and the kind of social infrastructure that's now going to the private sector that needs to come back to the public sector, in your opinion, to make those bonds happen.
Well, I think our way forward is public-private. It is. We have to have the investment of the large governmental structures, which is what happened as a result of COVID, where we have this new influx of resources. But I think the important thing in your question here is, what does the private sector leadership lead from? And that's where I think we do have good leadership, and which is why we're hurting from Monday, the loss of some of the important leaders that we had. But I think that's where, when I think about an opportunity, it is for the private sector to work with the public sector. And that's where our great history of our country is. That's how we were able to become the America that many of us have experienced, is the public-private sector. What has happened since 1970 is we've been just too much emphasis on what the private sector and the role that the private sector plays in the economy, and where everything has to be privatized. And so this I think has to be a change of the way we start to think about ourselves. And COVID was a great example of, if we had not had the governmental structure and the private sector working together, we would have never made it through COVID. We would not have made it. And that's a good example of the public and private sector coming together. I still say, up ahead, when we have generative AI and what these new technologies are going to represent, they're going to be a threat to the fabric of who we trust, our institutions, the importance of a library, the way that we think about truth. All those things are going to come at us. And we're going to need public and private, and I'm not even sure you can make a distinction after a while.
Eric, could you talk a little bit more about that? In a nutshell, how do we pay for these sorts of investments?
Here we are due to the fact that the Louisville Free Public Library is here, but also that there's a Louisville Library Foundation that's helping to, support all this stuff. And the library as an institution in the U.S. and other countries as well, there has been philanthropic money that, the Carnegie deal was, I'll pay for the building, but then everything after that is on you. And that's a public-private partnership of a sort.
So I'm wondering if you both could talk about the solutions you've seen from the ground up, from people themselves to fix these divides in our civic life. And I'll start with you, Nat.
Well, teaching at the university, I'm really privileged to see the world through the perspective of younger people. So I would like to leave my comments today with a sense of hope. I teach MBAs, but I also occasionally will have time to meet with undergraduates. They are enormously talented, and they have a lot to offer. That's the first thing. Second thing is, I also get a chance for the last 12 or 13 years, been teaching at Central High School. And I would just love for you all to know just how talented our young people are in this community. And they have different ideas, but we need to find a way to incorporate them into public policy. I've been working on trying to get 100 to 200 young people involved in healthcare, public policy, understanding the epidemic of loneliness. That is our key to the future. And that's where I think a city like ours, we're not that big, but we could do that. But we need the next generation, this generation, to put our arms around the minds of our young people and invest in them and less in us.
I wrote a book about the pandemic, actually, which is coming out in the beginning of next year. It's called 2020. And in 2020, I read a lot about mutual aid, the rise of mutual aid networks, and all the amazing things that I've seen people in communities do when the government kind of didn't step up, or when businesses didn't step up. And the stories are pretty amazing. Actually, we have a lot of capacity that we don't always see that shows up in these moments. In fact, I'm guessing what's been happening in Louisville the last few days is a very powerful demonstration of civic capacity. I don't know what's been happening in people's neighborhoods, but I'm guessing that there's been a lot of trauma this week and a lot of coming together as well. And so we've seen time after time communities that get traumatized find ways to do something better and to support each other. And I guess, the question for us now is really, can we galvanize that energy in a sustained way so that it's not just, the week or two after a shooting, or it's not just the month or two after a pandemic, but that it's something that informs us more regularly, because the kinds of battles that we're about to fight, you don't win these things with a 5-day attention span.
Thank you all for being here today, and thank you so much, Eric, for taking
Thank you.
a 4-year journey